Okay, so let's get into a few more details here about what the Federal Reserve does, a little bit more on a day-to-day basis. And so there's really three main areas that the Fed or most central banks are operating in. The first one is what I generally call regulation. So they don't in particular write laws. You may have heard of the Dodd-Frank Act and those types of laws that formally regulate parts of the financial industries. The Fed plays a little bit different role in terms of regulation. And so what they really do is monitor banks to verify that they're going to remain solvent. So we talked previously about the bank's balance sheet, a bank's balance sheet. And an important component of that is that they have sufficient assets to cover their liabilities. So the difference between those two we called stockholders' equity. And we want to make sure that stockholders' equity is sufficiently positive so that if the value of assets decreases, they are still going to be solvent. And so one job of the Federal Reserve is to monitor banks' financial statements, their balance sheets, to make sure that that's going to be true. So in the event like we have now, we've had this big shock to the economy, and the value of the assets that banks hold have gone way down. The Federal Reserve wants to be making sure that banks remain solvent, which keeps the banking industry moving. So that's an important role that they play, is to watch and monitor banks and make sure that they're going to have sufficient assets to cover their liabilities. Now, something that's overlooked, and it's not terribly exciting by any means, but it really is one of the most important things that the Federal Reserve Bank does, is to manage interbank transfers. Now, when you go to the store and you spend $100 on your debit card, right? And you swipe your card and all of a sudden magically you get to take the thing home and the merchant gets their money. Well, how does that all work exactly? Well, behind the scenes, the Federal Reserve Bank is the one that is making the transfer of the money in your checking account, $100, to the checking account of the merchant. So if, let's just say you bank at Citibank, and let's say that you go to Jimmy John's and they bank at Bank of America. So Jimmy John's has a checking account at Bank of America. You have a checking account at Citibank. So when you spend $100, the Federal Reserve is going to take $100 out of the reserves that Citibank keeps at the Fed. So remember, go back. We talked about banks and where they keep their reserves, and they keep a big chunk of their reserves on deposit at the Federal Reserve Bank. This is why. So what the Fed does is it says, okay, take $100 from the reserves on hand here from Citibank's account and transfer that $100 to the reserves that the Bank of America has. And so now we can kind of see why things like required reserves and the Fed monitoring and making sure that banks keep sufficient reserves on deposit at the Fed is to make sure that these interbank transfers can take place. So imagine, if all of a sudden you couldn't use your debit card to make transactions, engaging in commerce becomes significantly more difficult. So this is really a very important function that the Fed does, is to manage these interbank transfers. And it's something that's overlooked, but it's a very important feature. So then last but not least, they manage the macroeconomy, and this is that dual mandate. Right? So we'll try to understand how the Federal Reserve can use the money supply and a key interest rate called the federal funds rate in order to pursue its dual mandate of low inflation and full employment. And so that'll be our next task here, is to develop that framework that we call the Fed funds market.